because of the way in which the standards are formulated. I mean, you know this, the consensus-based development process that is used to bring in comments from as many stakeholders as possible is quite unique in formulating the standards. And of course, what's wonderful is that members from all over the world are involved in looking at and drafting these standards. This, for me, is quite different from the way in which many of the ethics charters are set up. Many of the ethics charters that I work with are very limited in the scope of their coverage, and the involvement of multiple stakeholders doesn't really happen when we're talking about ethics charters. For me then, as I was talking with my students about standards, I became interested in them because of the concept of consensus that was involved when setting up a standard.
You are listening to The Standard Show, the podcast that brings you the stories behind the standards, with Matthew Childs and Cindy Parakill.
Hello, this is Matthew Childs, and welcome to The Standard Show, the podcast that brings you the stories behind the standards. Now, over the past 5 years, we've spoken to all sorts of people on The Standard Show, from standards makers and standards users to young professionals and academics. But we've never interviewed someone who is both an academic and a philosopher, until now. The academic and philosopher in question is Catherine Botha from the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, and the voice you heard at the top of the episode. Catherine's teaching and research explores the intersection of ethics and aesthetics and the role of standards in society, offering perspectives on how we define and interact with systems of value and meaning. She was talking there about the AI management system standard ISO IEC 42001 and its relationship to ethics charters. And we wanted to speak to Catherine about 42001, AI standards, consensus and ethics, in part because of another fantastic guest we had on The Standard Show, AI expert and standards maker Pauline Nordstrom. In an episode we published back in April, I asked Pauline about how management system standards like 42001 address the diverse geographical contexts found around the world, the different value systems that you might find in the US, China, Europe and Africa. And she said this.
Well, it addresses it extremely well because it provides an operationalised framework for a business to use. But in terms of applying the more localised approaches to values, for example, a legal system that may prevail, the standard is flexible. So it does suggest the adoption of the OECD principles for trustworthy AI, which have also been embedded in every piece of regulation and a new treaty. So those principles cover fairness, accountability, bias, and so on, a commonly used set. But those may not be the same in every region. And therefore, the standard allows the organisation to define, we're in this region and these are the values we work to here, and this is what we will implement in our standard. And the standard doesn't actually prescribe that, which is why it is so good and so flexible and can be used in any jurisdiction.
So I picked this up with Catherine. I was interested in her perspective as an academic and philosopher about if there's a distinct African context for AI development. And in so doing, she provided a bit of an audio love letter to the voluntary, stakeholder-led development process of standards, one based on transparency and consensus, one that she describes as being able to deliver justice to the deployment of AI.
This is Cindy Parakill here, with a reminder that you can rate, review, and subscribe to The Standard Show wherever you get your podcasts. And you can get in touch and find and follow us on social media too. All the details are in the show notes.
So, Catherine Botha is a professor in philosophy at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. Catherine's known for making big ideas feel human and relatable, which might explain her many awards for teaching excellence. Her teaching and research are centred around the philosophy of art, culture and technology. Her strong background in the phenomenological tradition, a way of understanding the world through lived experiences, most especially the work of Nietzsche and Heidegger, brings a unique approach to the challenges found in the philosophy of AI. But not only that, Catherine is a registered ballet teacher at the Royal Academy of Dance, and she offers free tuition in classical ballet to students at the university. I spoke to Catherine about whether there's a distinctly African context for AI development and what cultural, social, or economic values should guide its deployment across the continent. We also discussed ISO IEC 42001 specifically, and whether, in her view, it has the flexibility and relevance to reflect and accommodate Africa's specific needs in the governance of AI. But I started by asking Catherine about her standards journey, one for which she is indebted to her very savvy students.
So I'm a philosopher, and to be honest, I was initially not very interested in standards. I was focused on looking critically at ethics charters. I was focused on the theory. And so the charters were really my main focus for most of my career. I had a vague idea that we had this South African Bureau of Standards that was the ISO member body in South Africa. And, my lawyer friends told me that there was a Standards Act. But this was really the full extent of my interest for many years. I must admit, I thought that standards were just watered down offshoots of ethics charters, that they had no really strong theoretical underpinning, and so they weren't really of much interest to me. But then, unfortunately or fortunately, I was involved in the design and teaching of the AI ethics module for the engineers in a master's program on AI that's being run at the UJ. And this is now the fourth year that this program is being run. And when I started teaching the program, I realized that the students that I was teaching weren't interested in ethics charters. These students are and were professionals working in the industry. And so they were actually using the ISO standards in their work. They weren't relying on the ethics charters that I was speaking about in our classes. And they wanted to interrogate the ISO standards because that's what they were familiar with. They were interested in knowing what to do in their particular environments. They weren't really interested, as I was, in reading about some abstract principles. So it was really my students' fault that I was forced to read the ISO standard. And then, of course, I was struck by the standard for two reasons. There's other reasons why one would think the standard is interesting, but for me, there were really two reasons why I thought they were interested or interesting. The first reason was because of the way in which the standards are formulated. You know this, the consensus-based development process that is used to bring in comments from as many stakeholders as possible is quite unique in formulating, the standards. And of course, what's wonderful is that members from all over the world are involved in looking at and drafting these standards. This, for me, is quite different from the way in which many of the ethics charters are set up. Many of the ethics charters that I work with are very limited in the scope of their coverage, and the involvement of multiple stakeholders doesn't really happen when we're talking about ethics charters. So for me then, as I was talking with my students about standards, I became interested in them because of the concept of consensus that was involved when setting up a standard. It seemed to me and to my students as well that there was an emphasis on relationality and an emphasis on interdependence. And that, of course, is a hallmark of the African philosophical tradition. So that came out of our discussions. I was also interested in the consensus-based development process because it seems to reduce the risk of a fragmented AI governance process. This idea that there's a sharing of ideas that we don't always find in some of the other theoretical approaches. So that was really the first reason why I was interested in the standards. There's another reason as well. That was the second reason is the focus on practice. So this is what my students were really interested in, this highlighting of operationalization rather than aspiration. This is what one of them said to me. So I think for my students who are working in industry, as opposed to the philosopher sitting in the ivory tower, so to speak, the standards were really taking these abstract ethical principles that I was trying to teach and asking, how do we turn them into actionable processes? How do we actually apply them when we're out in the real world? So, when we're talking about values and ideals in philosophy, fairness, transparency, accountability, that's wonderful, and that's really, really important. But my students were frustrated because the question was, how do we tell people in organizations how to implement these ideals, these values in practice? And so the standards surprised me because they were certainly telling me and my students how it can be done. And this is, of course, then something that we often miss in our philosophy classes. So I think important for me then is just to point out that the two are not in opposition. So we had this debate in one of our classes. The question is not choosing one or the other, but rather that looking at the ethics charter gives us a theoretical basis that can inform our vision, but the standards really tell us how to execute it. So give us the practical implementation. And that for me was quite fascinating. So yeah, it's been interesting and exciting to look at things quite differently, and to look at the ethics charters as standing alongside these standards, and seeing how my students really engage with both, looking at the theoretical and then the how, the practical.
So it sounds like your students helped you to be seduced by standards, really.
Well, yeah, I blame them for all the trouble. I could have been happily, reading my ethics charters, but now we've got an additional document to scrutinize, which, I mean, jokes aside, is actually really fascinating to look at the practical.
Catherine, I'd love you to unpack something for us, really. So what is meant by the philosophy of AI?
I think it will depend. The answer you're going to get is going to depend on the philosopher that you ask. So I think if you're speaking with the large majority of theorists working in the field today, you're likely going to get a definition that is skewed towards the ethics of AI. And this is really important, since we do need to think about how we use technology. And surely we would want an AI that's designed and implemented for the social good. Of course, there's debate as to what would constitute the social good, and how that good should bow to the demands of innovation and capital. So in the work of some theorists, there's an emphasis on the social and economic aspects of technologies, or on the way in which race, gender, or culture are impacted by them, or perhaps on the environmental impact of their development and implementation. So certainly the debate on what would constitute the social good plays a major role in many of the theorists' work when we're talking philosophy of AI. On the other hand, or maybe not on the other hand, because the approaches do overlap, but let's say on the other hand, there are philosophers who are interested in the artificial, in the word or concept intelligence, and so are interested in the philosophy of AI in the context of the epistemological or ontological questions that arise. So questions about what makes us human, or what exactly the artificial means in relation to the natural. These are the exciting questions that these philosophers are worried about. So questions about the nature of consciousness, for example, and whether we need consciousness when we're talking about artificial intelligence. This is really, really interesting to me. I'm particularly interested in whether attributes that we usually want to attribute only to humans, like creativity, are not perhaps attributes that can also be given to artificial intelligences. So I've written about this. It's something that I'm really interested in from the perspective of the philosophy of art. But there's also another way that we can approach the question you've asked. So for some philosophers, technology is not to be understood just as a collection of tools or processes that we use, but should rather be understood as a way in which we reveal the world, a way in which the world is revealed to us, and then how we ourselves are revealed. So in the case of artificial intelligence, we're not just dealing with new gadgets, new examples of technology. We're rather dealing with a way of seeing the world, of organizing the world in a new way. So this kind of approach to AI sees AI as a technology that tries to frame human beings, but all beings, as resources, as resources that can be processed, can be optimized, can be predicted. And so this is not a neutral act at all. And it's something that transforms the way that we understand what it means for us to be human. So this is a particularly interesting approach to looking at the philosophy of AI. Why? Because if we live in a world that's reduced to mere function and efficiency, then it's possible that we could lose our capacity to ask questions in a critical fashion. And we could then end up becoming complacent, domesticated, mere consumers. And so the question is then, well, okay, if that's the way that we want to understand artificial intelligence and the philosophy of AI, the question would be, well, what role would the ISO standards play here? It seems, that the standards are giving us, or promising to give us, order and clarity, and this interoperability, this bureaucratic guardianship, if you like. But then the question is that the only way we can see the standards? What are the standards helping us bring into being? Whose values are they encoding? And what kind of human subject are they presuming? So the philosophy of AI, when it's related to standards in this sense, is not just then a matter of asking what AI can do or how we can regulate it. It's a much deeper question than that. It's a question of the kind of reality that our creation of AI discloses. It's a question of what kinds of human beings are we becoming in response to the technology in which with which we are engaging.
Standards affect all of us every day, wherever we go, whatever we do. By defining good practice, they help people and organizations to do things better. Each year, standards bodies publish thousands of standards, and we are looking for more people like you to join our community of standards makers. We welcome applicants from all fields, backgrounds, and career stages. Our goal is a simple one: to have a balance of views around the table. By becoming a standards maker, you could help to improve the way things are made and done. like creating healthier and more inclusive workplaces, developing higher quality healthcare systems, making advances in AI governance, or accelerating climate action, and many, many others. So, if you want to make a difference and shape the world through standards, start your standards making journey now. Details of how to do so are in the show notes.
I want to come back and ask you about ISO 42001 in particular, and around those sort of values that you mentioned. But before we do that, you mentioned about sort of framing. And I want to ask you about the sort of framing or the context here in terms of Africa. So is there a distinct African context for AI development? And if so, what sort of unique cultural, social or economic values should guide the deployment of AI across the continent?
Okay, that's a really, really important question. I think first we must be very careful not to confuse or mistake context for mere locality or geography. I think, when we're talking about an African context, we're speaking about not just a mere place, but rather a philosophical ground, a different relationship to community, to knowledge, to temporality. And so, to answer your question shortly, I would say yes, there is. And I think it's something that can be very deeply developed if we really go and look at what our theorists are saying. So, for me, for example, the work of Sene Serakwebaran, Makhobe Ramose, and Makhoba More are really, really important when we're trying to understand what it means to recognize that African thought can bring to the table a kind of relational ontology that's different from an individualistic rationalism that seems to undergird much of what's happening in the development of AI development at the moment. So I think it's important for us to recognize that when we harness the concepts of the African philosophical tradition to try and understand AI or even to develop an ethics, this is never an innocent practice. So I've argued recently that when we try to use indigenous principle approaches, as they're called, so these are approaches that appeal to concepts like Ubuntu, we're going to limit their effectiveness in the development of AI ethics if we end up with vague appeals to the indigenous principle and nothing more. So a kind of a band-aid approach. And I think I showed it in my paper as well, I think there are a number of approaches that do this. So it just becomes popping a band-aid on and saying, well, we appeal to the rich tradition of African thinking without any attempt to show in detail how this kind of principle can be used in a way that is meaningful and that is, that is in depth. So for me, I think, from my point of view anyway, there is certainly room for a robust contribution to our thinking that'll go beyond the principle approach. And that comes from reading slogans like Ubuntu not just as slogans, but rather as deeper ontological claims. So I think if we really take these concepts seriously and work them out in detail, we can see, for example, that the concept of Ubuntu, reading it as an ontological claim, could transform the way in which we understand the concept of intelligence. So intelligence would then not just be the ability to calculate, but rather include the idea that intelligence has to do with participation in community. So from this kind of perspective, where we really engage deeply with the kinds of concepts that emerge from a relational approach that we get in the African philosophical tradition, as well as from the rejection of a kind of oculocentrism that we find where there's a focus on seeing and moving towards a focus on listening, to a focus on storytelling. We could then change the approach as to how we develop and deploy AI. The idea is that the dignity of the community and a respect for the past, as well as, and most important for me, a stewardship of future generations is included in the way in which we develop AI. I think also what emerges from this kind of perspective is the idea that the knowledge systems encoded within our AI must be rooted in an awareness of the epistemic justice or injustice in those encoding actions. So a kind of honoring of the plurality of knowledges and traditions that we have, rather than a one-sided approach or a band-aid approach. Let's just stick it on and forget about it. So I think what's important is an attempt then to interrogate and reconfigure the global AI tools that are developed and that are going to be developed from within this kind of perspective. Because, of course, what I think would be of significance is that even the very question of what constitutes a problem for AI to solve must be made with a cognizance that there are questions that emerge from particular African realities and not from development agendas that come externally. So, I mean, economically and socially, this would mean that AI can serve to reweave communal structures and not just unravel them. I think there's a lot of negativity and perhaps even fear that there'll be an unraveling of communal structures, all in the name of automation and efficiency. But I think local agency, the preservation of linguistic and cultural diversity, something that we spoke about at the conference that we held at the university last year, and the supporting of sustainability rather than reproducing these new forms of dependency could be the way forward if we're going to ask these kinds of questions.
Now, Catherine, as an academic, you are academic researcher, and obviously as a teacher, you're used to interrogating materials and encouraging your students to interrogate those materials and resources. Just wondering your view, sort of drilling down a bit now, and talking about the standard and ISO 42001 standard in particular. How effectively can 42001 be used to reflect and accommodate Africa's specific needs that you talked about, needs and values in the development and governance of AI?
I think perhaps I'll start the way that I start with my students. So, the ISO 42000 can be seen as a management system. It's an international standard. It's got a claim for neutrality, a claim for universality. And of course, very importantly, it's there to create order in this world of AI where things are changing every week. I can't keep up. But as a philosopher, I'm always going to ask, and I'm always going to tell my students to ask, if that's right, whose neutrality are we talking about here? Whose universality? So standards like technologies are never innocent. And so we've got to have transparency about how the standard is created. And of course, we've got to have the ability to interrogate those standards. So with that as my background, I think that very importantly, we should not be seeing Africa's contribution as simply additive. There are a number of theoretical contributions, and I've spoken about them a few moments ago, where the African philosophical perspective is pasted on like some kind of band-aid. I think if we're going to engage the question properly, we need to consider the question from an ontological perspective. What does that mean? Well, I think it means engaging with the development of standards, engaging with the question of what kinds of ideas of personhood, of community are being embedded within the standards as they are created. So Ubuntu, for instance, is not just a checkbox where we can tick it off and say, okay, we've got stakeholder engagement done. Ubuntu is much more than that. And of course, is rooted within the ideas of mutual recognition and ethical reciprocity. So I think the standard and the way in which it's being created is testament to that kind of idea. And that's, of course, why I was so drawn to interrogating the standards in the first place when my students inspired me to look at them. I think if African scholars, technologists, communities engage the standards not just as passive recipients, but rather are engaged as they are meant to be as co-authors, then there's room for a standard that has teeth, a standard that is useful to people working in the industry and in various contexts. So maybe I can give you an example. So if we're talking about the ISO 42001, the idea would be to look at how data governance models are explained within that context. And of course, if we do look at it, we see that there is a nod to this idea of collective consent, where risk is not just seen as statistical deviation, but much more than that. And this then would mean that we can see the standard as a meaningful instrument. If it's not just this neutral template, but rather a text that's negotiable. And that, of course, for me is the wonderful thing about the standard, is it's open to reinterpretation. It's open to critique. And in fact, that is what is required of it to be acknowledged as a standard. It's not just this neutral instrument that remains static and unchangeable. That way, it's not just a managerial tool, but it can be a means to ensure that justice takes place in the age in which we live, in the age of artificially intelligent machines. I thought that was really cool, and also that they're developed as stakeholder-driven processes. I think that was, for me, what really stood out is that the people who really care about these things are the people who are going to drive the process. And that, for me, is so indicative of an acknowledgement of how, when we engage with technology, it's always relational. There's not just sort of a top-down approach to it, but there are stakeholders who are all engaged and who are engaging one another. That, for me, is what gives us transparency, what gives us consensus. And so, for me, that kind of approach is really something that I would want to say aligns beautifully with the African philosophical tradition. It's practical, it's based on consensus, it's based on transparency, it's based on voluntary discussion and engagement. And yeah, is also, and I think for me, what stands out is also focused on not only the societal impact, but also on the environmental impact of the use of AI. Perhaps importantly pointing out that it's not trying to stifle innovation. So it's a kind of really trying to develop a balance between society and innovation within tech. So for me, I was I was really particularly impressed about those aspects of the standards creation process, but also the fact that the standards are not static entities; they're open to change. That for
Exactly,
me really
dynamic,
stood out.
always reviewed and revised. I just wonder, you mentioned there about obviously being a stakeholder. It's a stakeholder-driven process, and obviously academics are an important stakeholder group. Are you currently involved, or are you going to get involved in standards making yourself?
I am hoping to get involved. As I said, I came to a standards journey rather late, but I think philosophers should be getting involved.
Absolutely. Have SABs invited you?
I would be delighted to be.
Right, well, and the fact they haven't done it yet. Right, we need to rectify that, don't we? Our thanks to Catherine Botha, our first ballet dancing academic and philosopher with a love for AI and standards, for talking to us about ethics, AI and Africa. Now, if you want to know more about the themes raised in this episode and about how to get involved in standards, then check out the links in the show notes. And the show notes are also where you can find details of our socials and all the other ways to get in touch with us here on The Standard Show.
You have been listening to an episode of The Standard Show, the podcast that brings you the stories behind the standards, with Matthew Childs and Cindy Parakill.
You just heard a Stripped Media production.